Okay, well this afternoon what we're going to talk about now is landing techniques for tandem canopies. And the reason why we're going to address this subject is that today, if there are tandem accidents or incidents, the majority of them that are going to occur are going to be landing related. And for those of you that have been throwing drogues and doing tandems for more than 15 or 20 years, show of hands, anybody here, 20 plus years? Originally, it was tandem free fall and tandem drogue fall that was the dangerous part. And when the canopy opened, the majority of the dangers had dissipated, they'd gone away, because we had large, docile tandem parachutes that were bringing us back to Earth. So the idea that we could get injured or even killed on a fully functional tandem parachute was almost unheard of 15 or 20 years ago. If you were lucky enough to survive the drogue fall, the canopy ride was a treat coming down. There was no stress involved in that. Today, however, in large part due to the evolution of the sport, we have removed the vast majority of the tandem free fall and tandem drogue fall problems that we experience through updates of equipment, things like sky hooks and discs and Collins lanyards. And we've also at the same time improved the quality and construction of the tandem parachutes that we're operating with today. The one negative of that outcome with the parachutes, however, is that a lot of them have gotten smaller. A lot of them have gotten higher in performance, which has allowed us a greater flight envelope to use the parachutes in. So we're now jumping in conditions that we might not have been able to jump in 20, 25 years ago because we have more efficient wings. And with the right person underneath it, that's a good thing. It allows us to expand our operational capacities. It allows us to take more people in more remote and unique conditions. But the downside of that is that we are seeing an increase in incidents under fully functioning parachutes. And that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today, go through a presentation on just basically understanding tandem canopy flight. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have a better idea of where you fall, no pun intended, where you fall in the spectrum of tandem canopy flight. If you need to correct some of your behaviors, or perhaps you're doing everything right, perhaps the equipment you're using is not the best for the situation, or maybe it is. Regardless of where you fall or find yourself in that scenario matrix, understanding where you are will give you the opportunity to either improve or correct things, or give you the confidence of knowledge that everything in your situation is as good as it can be to give you the best chance for success on any of your tandem jumps that you're making, and specifically in this regard, your canopy landings. So with that said, I always like to offer a consideration to you guys. Don't take everything that I'm saying as fact just because I have a shirt that has the manufacturer and my name on it. If you have questions, if you don't agree with something, by all means, this is the venue to address it, and if not here, afterwards out in the hallway. My only goal here is to present some information to you, give you the opportunity to think about it, take a moment of pause, and think about how you're flying your tandem parachutes. And at the end of the day, whether you agree or disagree, as long as we're thinking about it and continuing to talk about it, then I will have considered this time well spent with you guys. So I'm going to start off with a baseline video just to kind of show you what the public realm exists. This was on MTV a couple years ago. If we had audio, you'd hear, oh my God. Both the passenger and instructor ended up okay. This is, like I said, this is in the public domain. This is on YouTube. This is out there for people to see. So what happened there? In this situation, it was a low turn to the ground that did not allow for the canopy flight cycle to complete. Can anybody tell me what the canopy flight cycle is? What does that mean to you or to me? Hank, not to put you on the spot, but...
Just fully glide again, under the canopy,
full recovery, full recovery of the turn. There is no longer a downward portion of the descent. When we initiate a turn, we start the flight cycle, and as it comes out of the flight cycle, it levels off. And obviously, in this situation, the instructor made a turn very low to the ground and did not allow for the canopy to finish its flight cycle, and they impacted the ground as the instructor was doing what we call a panic flare, trying to bring the canopy to a full stop, a full arrest while it's still in the turn. The problem with that in this situation is that the downward velocity of the canopy was greater than the flaring capability of the parachute in that situation, so the vertical or elevator effect was still continuing. So this video also illustrates a couple of other points in that the reason the turn happened the way that it did and the reason why this was led to what it did was there was a camera crew there. And the camera crew in and of itself is largely irrelevant other than they were trying to land in one very specific place. And in an attempt to get to that one very specific place, chose to make a low turn that was essentially unrecoverable from. And thankfully, no one got permanently injured in that, but that could have been catastrophic for both the instructor and the passenger. So keeping in mind that while we have accuracy expectations of where we intend to land, accuracy is not our primary goal. A lot of incidents happen under fully functioning parachutes because tandem instructors make low turns to the ground, not to get in front of a camera necessarily, but to land in front of a catcher, to land in front of the videographer. Those are our daily accuracy expectations. Well, this is a very larger than life example of what happens when you try to put yourself in a very specific spot when you're not able to do so. All of us could fall prey to this, not with the camera, but with the catcher and the videographer. So let's now discuss some of the ways we can work and fly our tandem canopies without putting ourselves in that position. All right, so in understanding tandem canopy flight, we have to first acknowledge that there's a number of different areas of canopy flying that create either a positive or a negative outcome every time we find ourselves under a tandem canopy. It starts ultimately with the skill of the instructor. We have to acknowledge that our skill levels, they ebb and flow. We can be highly current, we can be uncurrent. Here, do you guys jump year round, or is it an on again, off again season? You're typically busy in the summer, not so busy in the winter. So it's possible that a lot of you, myself included, I came from Boston. So when I first started doing tandems, I would have a 5-month weather break every year. And I would be highly uncurrent when the season started. So my skill level in October was vastly different than my skill level in May. And I had to recognize that as I put a parachute over my head or as I put a tandem parachute over my head at the beginning of every season. My skill level was going to go up and down. The same philosophy holds true for experience level. Whether you have 10 tandem jumps, 100 tandem jumps, 1,000, 10,000 tandem jumps, our overall skill level is going to go up potentially as we get more experience. But the fear there, or the cautionary tale there, is just because we have 5,000 or 10,000 tandem jumps, it doesn't necessarily make us safer if our behavior becomes less safe. What do I mean by that? As our experience level becomes safer, our performance tends to wane and become less safe to keep a relative level of risk in what we do. It's called risk homeostasis. If I do something 10,000 times and I get really good at it, I should be safer than when I had 1,000 jumps or 1,000 opportunities to do it. But if at 10,000 times doing something like a tandem jump, I start to take more aggressive behaviors, making bigger turns, lower turns to the ground, out of boredom, out of a number of reasons. I'm now keeping that risk level constant by taking more aggressive behaviors the more experienced I get. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of our skill factors. Then we're going to talk about communication, how we can communicate with each other, communicate with the ground. We're going to talk about landing patterns, inducing speed to land, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We're going to talk about the different types of landings that we see in the field, talk about canopy size differences and how that affects our wing loading. Then we're going to talk about turbulence. And my favorite, or I think one of the most important items in tandem canopy flight is knowing when not to fly the canopy, knowing when to stand down, when you realize that the conditions have exceeded either your ability or the ability of the equipment. So we're going to cover all these topics and then offer some conclusions. In between all that, I'll show you a few videos of examples of what it is we're seeing in the field. So in terms of our skill level, one of the greatest problems that we see today is that based on how both sport parachutes and tandem parachutes have been built over the last 10 years, both of them are relatively high performance compared to what we had both in, again, sport parachute and tandem parachute 15, 20 years ago. It's a good thing. In general, it's a good thing. However, the danger area is that some of our high performance canopy pilots, people that are flying Peregrines and Petras and Leias and Valkyries, that they are attempting to apply the same high performance canopy flying skills on their sport parachutes to their tandem canopies. They're flying aggressive. They're trying to make low aggressive turns to the ground as they would on their sport parachutes. And under a sport canopy, that is perfectly acceptable. We are free to do what we want and express ourselves. But under our tandem canopies, we have to revert back to not what we could do, but what we should do. We're capable of high-performance tandem landings, absolutely, but that's not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is flying our tandem parachutes like a taxi cab driver or like a pickup or like a transport truck driver, slow and deliberate canopy patterns. The other thing we deal with skill sets is a false sense of security, ego management. Because we are really good at one thing, maybe it's canopy piloting, maybe it's wingsuiting, maybe it's tunnel flying. Because we're really good at one thing, we tend to think that that transfers over into everything that we do. So we see a lot of tandem instructors with a high amount of experience in one area or another, that they believe that they are better than they actually are, because ultimately the gear has such a low malfunction rate that being a tandem instructor, when done correctly, is actually a very simplistic process and can be done repeatedly hundreds of times a year successfully. We tend to think we're better than we are. And while in the 1990s the incident rate might have been somewhere around 1 in 200, today it's around 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 5,000, depending upon where you are. And it's just human nature. If you do something 5,000 times and it works out well for you, you're going to think you're pretty good at what you're doing, right? And some people have the ability to keep their egos in check. Others do not. We tend to work in a type A personality here. A lot of us tend to be very excited about the things we do, so it's not uncommon for tandem instructors to have an overdeveloped sense of security or overdeveloped sense of ego in how they're flying their tandem parachutes. And we're all human, we're all capable of it. Recognizing it and then keeping it in check, that's the critical point. Making sure that we understand that it's happening and stopping it from leading us into aggressive behaviors. The next item there is prorated instructors. What does that mean? Well, what does a prorating mean? Do you guys call it display? I think here, what's the... And you're proving that you can land at a predetermined point in the ground, right? Before you leave the ground, I'm going to land here or within 50 meters of this target. You get in the aircraft and you land there, right? Well, one of the leading factors in tandem injuries today is a lack of accuracy, not being able to land a tandem parachute accurately. Off landings, landing away from the primary landing area and then trying to get back to it by making low turns, not being able to fly a pattern, not being able to accurately get back to a point on the ground is a lost art form. So I would ask you all as tandem instructors to self-evaluate. This is the best way to fix any problems that may or may not exist. When you guys go to the drop zone tomorrow or in March or April, whenever you go back to start throwing drogues, pick a point in the ground. Doesn't matter where it is, doesn't have to be the P pit. Pick a point on the ground and then land there. Sounds simple, right? You might not be able to do it after one attempt. And if you can't do it after one attempt, try again. Hopefully you get closer than the time before. And if you can't do it after 2 or 3 attempts, get help. Find someone that can help you with your accuracy. Any canopy coaches here, canopy piloting? Okay. Pretty simple to teach canopy piloting basics as far as how to land on a specific point in the ground if you know what to look for. So that brings me to the last point here. If you can't land accurately, and we do see accidents where tandem instructors land in trees, land on roads, land in backyards, and when we look at the history of that person, that is never their first time landing off. That is never their first time landing inaccurately. It's usually the 10th or the 100th, or that person is just not very good at getting back to the primary landing area. But rather than fix the problem before it causes an accident, we allow things to continue until the accident occurs. So ask yourselves, am I capable of landing within a 50-meter radius of a target? And if you can do that, great. You're jumping the right parachute at the right skill level and the right currency. But if you can't do that, fix it. Fix it now. Get canopy coaching. Fix the problem before you find yourself landing in a place that you can't land safely. So the next item is communications. There's 2 critical communication points for tandem canopy safety. The first one is ground to air. We work in turbulent conditions. Sometimes the ground winds are acceptable for landing when we take off, but they may not be acceptable for landing when we exit the aircraft. And if you do this long enough, you will have left an aircraft after the wind conditions have changed to the negative, where they've gone to a position where it's not safe to land. And that's one of the worst possible scenarios for the manifester, calling up to the pilot and saying, winds have changed, they're now 22, gusting 28, and the pilot responds back, they just left. They've already exited the aircraft. And once we're out of the aircraft, we're going to land, whether we have good conditions or not. So identifying as to whether or not your drop zone has quick and accurate reporting and communications between ground and pilot before dropping the tandems will drastically reduce the probability of you guys ending up in conditions under canopy that are not conducive to landing. Catching it before you leave the aircraft rather than after you leave the aircraft is a much better place for us to be in if we want to have long-term safe canopy flying under tandem. The other one is air-to-air. This is basically a principle that two bodies can't occupy the same space at the same time, right? That's I don't know, someone smarter than me said that. You can't have two objects in the same space at the same time. Yet, as tandem instructors, we are all trying to arrive at the same location, the center of the P-pit, right? We're all trying to land accurately in front of the videographers. So that creates conflict, the conflict of tandems trying to land at the same spot. We've gotten out at different altitudes, or excuse me, different places in the exit order. We're opening, well, at the same altitude roughly, at different spaces across the sky along jump run, but we're all trying to get to the same point on the ground. And what that creates is canopy conflict as we're all trying to descend to the same spot. Have you guys ever been on level with someone at 3,000 feet? You look over and they're right beside you. You're both trying to get to the same spot? Anyone? Okay. You make a turn to go one way, you look back, and they're still there, right? And then you go the other direction, and they're still there. You can be together at 3,000, at 2,000, at 1,000, and if you guys are following each other down, the potential for conflict on landing drastically increases. So this can be fixed in one simple solution, communicating two instructors to each other. We all know what the international sign of kicking my legs means, right? It means I can see you. And if you kick your legs back, you're telling me you can see me too. Do you guys agree with that? If we're flying canopies together and I start kicking my legs, I'm saying, hey, look at me. And then you in turn kick your legs back and say, hey, look at me too. We've now established communication between each other. So now we have that communication. What can we do with it to make ourselves safer? If you look back and you see me doing this, what am I telling you? You go first. I'm sitting in brakes. If we are on level at 3,000 feet and I'm flying in brakes, I am telling you, descend below me. You would then make a turn to drop altitude. You would then reduce that probability of having a conflict because now we have vertical separation. This can happen at 5,000 feet. It can happen at 3,000 feet. It can happen on final, getting ready to land. If I'm at 1,000 feet and I see another parachute beside me, I can sit in brakes and I can let that parachute descend in front of me. If we communicate that to each other, we are much more likely to have a positive outcome than just trying to rush down to the ground one after the other and arrive at the same spot on the ground. So again, kicking our legs, communicating with each other, and then one of the two choosing to put their arms out to hold in brake so the other one can see it, and then the other one responding accordingly. If you have 3 or 4 people on the same lift, that's even more important to have that communication between each person. Okay, basic stuff here are landing patterns. They should be predetermined, meaning that we should be able to look at an overview of the airport, see a definitive downwind, crosswind, and into the wind, which is predictable. When we start to create chaotic landing patterns, short finals, long crosswinds, avoidance of objects or things on the ground, the more complex we make the landing pattern, the more likely we are to not be able to follow it. So having a predetermined pattern that everyone's going to follow will prevent one person from cutting off the next person. Having it predictable, something that we can all understand and that we've all been trained to do, is going to make it a higher likelihood of success for all involved in the order. And then most importantly, having a pre-established order. If we have 5 tandems on a lift, do you think, yes or no, that on the ground we could figure out, based on canopy size, based on wing loadings, who should exit first, who should exit last, and allow everyone to land in that predetermined order? I bet you guys could do it. I would bet every dollar, I'd bet every pound in my wallet that we could take any 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people in this room, have a short conversation before boarding the aircraft, and ensure the same pre-existing order lands together. Do you guys agree? Okay, so that being said, that's not always happening. We do have situations where we put the third person out and the first person to land. We put out 4 or 5 people and they're all landing at the same time. And the reason is they're just not taking that moment on the ground in the boarding area or even prior to that during a staff meeting and discussing who's going to land where, when, and how. And while the dynamics of what we do changes based on weights and winds and parachutes available to us, we're all mildly or marginally intelligent, right? We can all manage this process. If we earned our tandem rating, we're probably capable of figuring out how to land safely in an order. But if we don't think to do it, it's not going to happen. So in order for that to happen, we have to get into a culture of hanging out in the air as opposed to trying to rush down to the ground. Some of the incidents we see in the field today are directly resulting from tandem instructors who are rushing to get down to the ground because maybe they want the small parachute, the new harness, they want the lightest passenger, they want to make, basically maybe they want to smoke a cigarette between lifts, whatever it is. And the rushing down to the ground creates chaos amongst everyone in the pattern. So changing our culture to it's okay to hang out, it's okay for us to stay in breaks and wait for the person in front of us to get down. Changing that culture is going to make a huge difference in the potential for canopy conflict as we land one after the other. And the worst person to work with is the express elevator. Who is the express elevator? That's the guy or girl you work with that no matter where they are in the exit order, first, second, third, fourth, or fifth, they are always the first one down. That person absolutely is a smoker. I'm kidding. They usually smoke because they want to get down and have a cigarette before the next load. They're usually rushing down for the next best harness, the lightest passenger. There tends to be a lot of selfish focus on their own behaviors and their needs at the drop zone. It's all about them, and we're basically in their way to prevent them from getting to the ground. So the express elevator, the reason they're so dangerous is that if they're the first one down, they tend not to be too much of a problem. But if they're the second, third, fourth, or fifth, the other people in that cycle of canopies, rather than focusing on their own patterns, they're thinking about the express elevator. Where are they in the pattern? We know they're going to cut us off at some point. So if we're looking around for them, rather than flying our pattern, we increase the probability of a conflict and of an incident on our own canopy, rather than focusing on flying our own safe, predictable pattern. So express elevators can be slowed down, they can be taught, they can be changed, but if they aren't, and someone, no matter where they are, can't exit anywhere but being the first one down, put them out first or don't work with them, because you're going to create dangers to yourselves and everyone else around you if people are behind you trying to cut through your traffic patterns, rushing down to the ground. So the next topic is whether or not we induce speed to land. Is speed a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing, right? More speed, more power, more flare. So inducing speed to land does actually give us more flare power. However, we want to acknowledge that every tandem parachute built today is designed to land on a straight-in approach. Every tandem parachute can be landed straight in approach, hands up, full flight, land and flare. So there is no need to induce speed for landing. We can choose to do it, but as professionals, we have to acknowledge we're choosing to do it as a technique to give ourselves more flare power for one reason or another, but it is not required. So we're not required to induce speed to land, but if we do want to induce speed to land, the two primary ways we do that are the sink surge approach and the carving turn. The sink surge approach is basically bringing the canopy down into brake flight, whether it's half brakes or almost a 3/4 brakes, depending upon what you're trying to do with the sink surge. Releasing it back up into full flight, the canopy enters a flight cycle and starts to dive, and if it's timed just right, it will plane out onto the ground for a nice, smooth, solid flare. The negatives of that is if you hold it too long, the flight cycle does not complete and you have to panic flare out of it, for lack of a better term. Or if you let up too high, the flight cycle will also stabilize too high and then drop the tandem pair down to the ground, however many feet off the ground you are. It starts the cycle all over again. So sink surge can be done successfully. The benefit of it, it keeps the canopy over your head. It is firmly and squarely over your head as it's happening, and wing level is one of the most important landing priorities, so you're not violating wing level over your head if you are in a sink surge approach. The other inducing speed to land turn technique is the carving turn, and that is essentially a flat braked turn where we're bringing one toggle down to our shoulder and creating a wide, slow turn to final, letting that toggle back up again, and then that same cycle will begin ever so gently to final to land. The benefit of a carving turn is it gives you a very wide opportunity to recognize if you're too low or too high, and you have the opportunity to correct that turn as it is happening. The downside of that is if you are carving to final and you are too high and you continue past the wind line, you could potentially create conflict to the person behind you. Or if you start the turn too low and you let up before you reach the wind line, you can create a conflict to the person landing to the other side of you. So there's always the potential for conflict in carving turns. What about hook turns? The best way to land the tandem canopy, right? I'm just seeing if you guys are still awake. No, toggle whipping hook turns are absolutely the worst possible way to induce speed to land. And the reason for that is that when you get the turn heights wrong and the inputs incorrect, the likelihood of injury is almost 100% in terms of sprained ankles, broken legs, things like that. When hook turns go wrong, there are dramatic injuries that occur to the passengers. So essentially, we have a zero tolerance policy for toggle whipping hook turns. The other big problem with toggle whip hook turns is that you're deflating the canopy and you're losing the flare of that side of the parachute as it is starting its aggressive turn to the ground. So if you do have to panic flare out of a hook turn, you do not have the full flare above you and behind you to get you out of that. So just a terrible thing. You shouldn't be doing hook turns with your toggles. Okay, moving on to landings. There's basically 3 different ways we land tandem parachutes. We can slide in or sit the landing, or stand up. And typically the distinguishing factor between the two is the wind condition. If we have high wind conditions, we tend to stand up our landings. If we have low wind conditions, we tend to slide in our landings. There's no one better versus the other. Some will tell you standing up your landings, you can injure the passenger, ankles, knees, hips, back, neck. Others will tell you slide-in landings can injure your passengers, ankles, knees, hips, back, neck. So it really depends on your perspective. Both of them have the potential for injury, and both of them have the potential to be done cleanly and smoothly without injury. It's really just a matter of technique and ultimately choosing the right landing for the winds and the conditions that you're landing in. My favorite is the run-out landing, the tabletop as we call it. That is essentially a slide-in condition where we have no wind. The tandem canopy is coming in very fast, and rather than choosing a slide-in, the tandem instructor attempts to run out the landing. And most of us would have a difficult time running 15 miles an hour without a passenger in front of us. Put a passenger in front of you, they inevitably go feet, knees, face in front of the instructor because they can't keep up with the tandem instructor, and the instructor then falls on top of them, puts their arms out in front, and tries not to crush them in what looks like a tabletop landing where the legs and arms of the instructor are over the passenger and the instructor is trying to keep his body off the passenger. Anybody seen that recently? I'm not making it up, right? It does happen, the tabletop landing. It's a real easy way to injure your passengers. Yes, it does keep your jumpsuit clean, but that shouldn't be the focus of the landing, right? Ensuring the passenger's safety is our number one priority. So there's really no room in our sport in tandem for run-out landings or for tabletopping our passengers. We're either sliding it in or standing it up, one or the other. If not, rethink the way you're landing your parachutes. And the last one here, finish your flare. There are a number of canopy injuries from tandem instructors who physically aren't able to finish their flare or simply choose not to finish their flare. We're all familiar with the 2-stage flare. We bring the canopy down to around our shoulders. Somewhere the transition between our shoulders and our hips, the canopy, the first stage of the flare occurs, it levels off in flight, and then we have all that flare at the bottom end to slow the parachute down and stop. In one scenario, we have instructors who aren't strong enough to finish the flare, and they just stop. And what happens as the canopy starts to bleed off speed, it just drops to the ground. And that's one way to injure our passengers. The other reason we see tandem instructors not finishing their flare is because they don't have to do it with their sport parachutes. Most of today's sport parachutes can be landed in half breaks or less. If you get the landing right, you don't even have to finish the flare of your sport parachutes. So they go back to trying to fly their tandem parachutes like sport parachutes. They flare the canopy just enough to plane it out, and then they stop flaring. And inevitably the same thing happens. At the end of the canopy descent, it loses air, it drops out on them. So finishing the flare, you paid for all that flare. All that flare is built into the parachutes, right? Why not use that? And if it's a strength thing and you can't finish the flare, one of two things will happen. You will either go back to the gym and get stronger and fix the problem, or you will continue to land in half breaks because you're not strong enough to finish the flare and you will injure a passenger eventually. Those are the only two options. If you're not strong enough to finish your flare, either fix it by going to the gym or accept the fact you're going to injure a passenger and it's going to be your fault, your responsibility, not theirs. Are we clear on that? We understand that. We'd all prefer the first option. Go to the gym, get healthy, fix the problem, but don't allow yourself to just flare enough to get the canopy flat and then let it drop down on the ground, because we do see that over and over again. So over the years, canopy sizes have gone from really large to really small. The first tandem parachute I ever flew was 520 square feet. It was made out of an F111 fabric. It was called a T520. And when I brought the right toggle down, you know what happened? Nothing. Eventually, the canopy would register I wanted to go that way, and it would start turning very slowly. Today, we're jumping zero porosity canopies, 340s, 330s, even some 300s in New Zealand and Australia. And the difference is the response time. When those toggle inputs are made, the canopy is reacting very quickly to those responses. The difference between the two is that I'm only human. I think it was Noel that brought that up this morning, the human factor of what we do. I'm going to make mistakes under canopy. I'll be the first one to acknowledge that. I will make a mistake. When I recognize it and how much time I have to fix it is entirely dependent upon the parachute over my head. If I make a mistake under P520, I have all the time in the world to register that I've made a mistake and fix that and create an alternate path. But if I'm under a 340 square foot parachute, 500 pounds full heavy loading, and I make that same input, my mistake recognition needs to be a lot quicker because I don't have the same amount of time to register that the mistake has occurred and hopefully correct it before I put myself and my passenger in a dangerous situation. So understanding the smaller the parachutes are, thus the smaller window of opportunity we have to recognize mistakes and to correct them before they become problems. Another issue we deal with tandem canopies is that our wing loading changes almost every time we jump. You go from a really heavy passenger to a really light passenger. The wing loading changes, and thus our entry points in our altitude turns are going to change ever so slightly. We can complicate that even more if there's multiple size parachutes in the drop zone. Any of you guys work at drop zones with varying size canopies, 370s, 340s? So every time you change the canopy size, you're also changing your wing loadings. So passenger weight changes, canopy size change. Recognizing what those wing loading changes are going to do to how the parachute performs is critical to prevent injury and incident because they're going to react differently under the same meteorological conditions. So ultimately, what does all that mean? We can plan for success. We're smart enough. We know how wing loading affects our ability to operate the tandem canopies. Small parachutes heavily loaded are really good in high wind situations. If there's a low wind condition and we have large parachutes lightly loaded, that's okay too. And we try to always match our wing loading to the weather conditions. If we have if we have two tandem instructors, a large parachute and a small parachute, and it's a high wind, the heavier instructor should take the larger parachute, and if the lighter instructor should take the heavier student to give both instructors the best opportunity, best chances for getting through those high winds. But if the heavy instructor takes the small parachute and the heavy passenger and leaves the lighter instructor with the larger parachute and the light passenger, they're going to land in another county, right? That's kind of a selfish act. I know that's going to happen, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm selfish. I want to make sure I get back in the express elevator. But just thinking ahead of time, I like the concept of being an oracle, of being able to tell the future, right? When we look at canopy choices and canopy conditions, we're all oracles. We can all see what that decision is going to create for us in terms of an outcome before we put the harness on, before we put the parachute on. Do you guys agree that if you look at the weather conditions, look at your wing loading, look at the size of the parachute and the size of your passenger, you have a pretty good opportunity to predict the outcome, whether it's a good combination of parachute and person or a not so good combination of parachute and person. And if you stop and think about that on the ground before you board the aircraft, you'll never have to deal with the consequences of a bad decision after you've left the aircraft. So I would just encourage you guys to think about that, take a moment of pause and think about, in different varying wind conditions, am I taking the right parachute and the right wing loading of passenger to give myself the best chance for success? And if you are, fantastic, you're doing all the right things. If you're not, if you're just grabbing the first rig available, grabbing the first passenger available, and not analyzing how that's going to make an effect in your canopy flight, then now's the time to stop and add that back to your canopy process. And the next thing is turbulence. Has anybody ever had a tandem canopy collapse on them on their way back to the airport? Yes, it's not a great place to be in. I used to work somewhere where they said a certain type of parachute was prone to collapse, and when it did, the best thing to do is just look forward, because if you looked up, you were going to see a collapsing parachute over your head, and all that was going to do was upset you. So just stare to the horizon until it reinflated, and then carry on. And 10 years ago, I think I actually did that once. I was dumb enough to allow that to happen. But being under a collapsed canopy at about 3,000 feet as it was putting us back into free fall, I thought to myself, it would be much better to be on the ground, looking up at the sky, and being up in the sky, down on the ground. And it got me thinking about how turbulence affects our ability to fly the parachutes that we do. what I was dealing with was turbulence that was essentially unpredicted. It was high enough, we couldn't tell what the winds were doing at 3,000 and 4,000 feet. But then it got me thinking about low-level turbulence. Do any of you guys work and operate at airports that have turbulent inducing buildings, trees, runways, right? Do we end up flying over them? Sometimes, right? We fly over these turbulent areas because we don't have a plan for avoiding them. So my recommendation is simply this. Go home, clearly identify what the turbulent areas are, and then look at your overview of your drop zone and figure out, why are we flying over these turbulent areas? Is it our jump run? Are we getting out in the wrong spot? Because with jump runs, we can move them ever so slightly to give ourselves the best chance for success to avoid turbulence. And if not, figure out a way to either remove the turbulence or find a safer place to land. When a canopy collapses in turbulence over a tree line or over a hangar, that is the logical outcome of an illogical act. It's a hot day, the sun's coming off the tarmac, it's heat sending air up to the sky, we fly through it, it collapses. When that happens, we don't go, wow, that was just bad luck. That was the logical outcome of a bad decision, flying over a turbulent area. So avoiding turbulence is critical to canopy safety. We've all been there, and unfortunately we'll probably all be there again in the future, but limiting that to as little of an exposure as possible, or ultimately removing it, should ultimately be the primary goal. Now, sometimes it's just too turbulent to even go skydiving, right? How do we know when? After we've almost gotten clipped by it, right? We land we make a mistake, we land in turbulent conditions, and we say, we're done, we're out of here. Ideally, we will have established our limits before we reach them. That's the most important thing I can offer you in terms of tandem canopy flight today, is that we all have limits, whether it's turbulence, whether it's a maximum wind speed, whether it's a maximum weight of the passenger, maximum or minimum size of parachute. We all have limits as to what we can and cannot operate in safely. I can tell you that 10 years ago, my limits were much higher than they are today. I was averaging 700 to 1,000 tandems a year. I was highly current. I could fly all kinds of parachutes in all kinds of conditions. Today, I might make 300 tandem jumps a year. And most of those, as Mark mentioned, were on the front of our instructors as passengers. I'm a highly current tandem passenger. I'm not a very current tandem instructor, so I'm not going to fly in the same conditions I would have 10 years ago. Every time I go to a different drop zone, a different country, a different location, I ask myself on the ground, what are the maximum winds I will fly in today? Let's say I decide today, based on the gear and my currency, is 18 miles an hour. I know that on the ground. I won't board an aircraft if it's over 18 miles an hour. If it's marginal, I will talk to the pilot, I will talk to the manifest and say, I don't want to get out if this gusts over 18. Call up before we exit and check the weather, check the winds before giving the exit call. I would much rather stand down before I reach my limits than find out after the fact that I've exceeded my limits. Because now I still might land safely, but rather than using my skill bucket, which bucket am I using? My luck bucket. And which one's more likely to run out first? The luck bucket. So I want to avoid that bucket as much as possible and keep my skill bucket full by only flying within the conditions that I feel capable. So ultimately, define your limits before you reach them. The limits should be based on your currency, the canopy sizes, and the passenger weights. And if you do stand down, don't make a show of it. Don't just say, I'm out of here, it's too dangerous for me, because you might be more current than me. And it might be safe for you to make a tandem jump and not me today. So if I don't want to skydive today, I'm not going to make you feel bad about it or pound my chest and say the conditions are too dangerous. I'm simply going to accept that it's above my skill level at the moment, but not yours, and just casually disappear off into the RV area and play video games. But don't pound your chest and say it's unsafe. If I can't go, you shouldn't go, because all that does is it creates liability. If there is an incident or an accident, then you could potentially put that other person in a libelous situation where it might have been within your skill set, and it was simply an act of God that there was an accident, but you've now created this expectation that it's too dangerous to jump today. Did any of you guys ever think about your tandem videographers and how they can influence your ability to land your canopy safely? Well, typically we rely on our videographers to spot the aircraft. They're the ones opening the door, and while we should all be looking out the door before we go, most tandem instructors don't, let's be honest. They trust their videographers. If the green light's on, the door's open, the videographer says, let's go. Most tandem instructors will just follow the videographers blindly out the door. So making sure that your videographers are good spotters. If they're in flight with tandem canopies, if the third tandem has a video and the first one doesn't, what's going to happen? The videographer is going to overfly the tandem canopy. There have been numerous tandem canopy collisions with sport parachutes over the years where sport canopies, whether it's a videographer or an AFF student, have tried to fly back through the tandem pattern and collided with them. So being very careful of that. And then landing area influence. Making sure that the videographers are landing in wide open spaces so the tandem instructors also have the ability to land in wide open spaces. Not landing beside the hangar, not landing beside the fence or the beer line or people. Putting them in a clean area for landing will increase the tandem's likelihood of a safe, successful landing. So in conclusion, educate yourself on the gear you're using, the training, and if you don't have the necessary training, get it through canopy coaching, and understand the conditions you're flying the canopies in. Don't ever get lazy or soft with your canopy flying. Demand professionalism of yourself and everybody around you every time you put a tandem parachute over your head. And ultimately, staying current is one of the best things we can do to prevent accidents and incidents. And you can do that by having staff meetings, talking about canopy flight, talking about patterns and exit orders and pre-established orders of landings. Having this in our consciousness through staff meetings regularly intervaled will give us a better chance for success and ultimately respect what we do. Being a tandem instructor, when everything goes right, is not that difficult. You can do it thousands of times without incident. But it's when things change and things don't go right that we have to react. That's when things start to get more dangerous. So putting ourselves in positions where it's highly unlikely things will change on us and giving ourselves the best chances for a successful outcome will give us the greatest chance of uninterrupted, calm tandem canopy flight, and that is the goal. And the last thing here, we put a rule in UPT, no turns over 90 degrees. And the reason we did that, this is for landing, no turns over 90 degrees under 500 feet. We recognized a pattern that, again, everyone's going to make mistakes. But if you make a mistake under 90 degrees, the outcome typically ends up being a bruised ego, a dirty jumpsuit, and maybe a sprained ankle. When we make bad decisions and make mistakes over 90 degrees, 180 degree turn to land, 270 degree turn to land, the speed and force and impact is so great that we start to see what we call crippling injuries, compound fractures, tib fibs, broken femurs, broken hips, shattered coccyxes, etc. So we put this rule in place. Prior to this rule, we were averaging 4 to 5 crippling injuries a year, snapped femurs, broken hips, etc. Since that rule has been in place, and it's been almost 3 years now, the incident rate of crippling injuries has gone to 0, with one exception. The people that have ignored us, the people that know better than we do, that still do 180s and still do 270s, that ignore, they're so far away from us, we can't control what they're doing, and they are still crippling people. They're still breaking femurs. They are still tib-fibbing passengers. So this rule, if you follow this rule, you will never cripple a passenger, and that should be something that's on your consciousness, your mindset, every time you put a tandem up in the air. The passengers not have any expectations of breaking their femur. And if you have a cricket stick, right, a cricket bat, try to break it against a tree. That's about how much force, did I say it right?
Cricket stick, that was,
Yeah.
no, that was good.
Yeah, well, I'd say bat, but a baseball bat in the U.S. So a baseball bat or a cricket bat,
A hockey bat.
a hockey bat. Try to break that against a tree. That's about how much force and energy is needed to snap a femur. That's how much force and energy is being generated in these big turns that go wrong. So ultimately, returning your passengers to the ground safely in the same condition you found them, happy and smiling, is our number one goal. And if you limit your turns to 90 degrees or less, you'll never have to live with the fact you snapped somebody's femur. So really, it is that serious, and think about it. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of videos now. We can actually turn the recording devices off in the back for the cameras. I'm going to show you some videos just to be fair to the people in them. We don't need it published and put on the internet. Today, we're surviving the drogue fall and free fall with drastically greater percentages because of the better gear we're jumping. But again, due to risk homeostasis, the gear got safer, so our behaviors got less safe to keep the incident rate constant. That's the bad news. The good news is we can recognize it, and we can improve our performance and our how we use the gear, and use the gear in a less risky capacity as it pertains to canopy flight, and we can reduce incidents. No one deserves a broken femur. No one deserves a broken hip or broken back. Those are induced mistakes based on instructor mismanagement of the process. If you follow the rules and regulations and fly your tandem canopies like a school bus or a taxi cab, well, maybe not a taxi cab here, but if you fly the tandem parachutes like a school bus, these sorts of things can't happen. So just be mindful, ask yourself, how am I flying my tandem parachute? Is it for me or is it for them? And if it's for you, easily just shift it to your passenger's focus and you will have no issues moving forward. So that wraps up canopy flying. Does anybody have any questions, concerns, or comments? Okay. Anything useful in here? Anybody taking away something they can go back and apply to their drop zone, like the communication, dropping altitudes? Excellent. Let's take 5 and then we'll come back with, what else am I doing?
Drugs.
Drogue throws, yes. We'll come back with drogue throws, yes.